So, I got a lot of comments warning me about Zelda 2, telling me that, yeah, it's not going to be the greatest, and, oh boy, I should have listened, because I hated it. And you know, I didn't want to hate this game, far from it. And, I mean, yeah, part of that comes from having to sit down and actually play it. No one wants to spend hours with something they hate, but in this case, it's a little different. Zelda 2 is what you'd call a black sheep, a game wildly different from what came before or after. These kind of games oftentimes go on to be really divisive, and a lot of people end up really hating them. But it's these entries I find the most interesting. I like seeing a take on a franchise so completely out of the realm of normalcy, and these black sheep games try to take ideas that make the others great and push them in a different direction. Now, when this doesn't work, these games usually flop hard, and boy, it sucks. But man, when it works, whew, that's when the magic is made. And trust me, I wanted and hoped Zelda 2 would be one of the ones that worked. Even knowing just how much was going up against it, I was truly hoping I'd come out of it having another gem to add to the collection. But sadly, that wasn't the case. Zelda 2 is absolutely a game that has its moments of brilliance, but every one of those is just surrounded by heaps of terrible, cryptic, and frustrating design, and this leaves me in an awkward position. Up to this point, I've never had to talk about a game that I actually hated. I've definitely been critical at times, but I've never had such a negative outlook on something I was covering. And this presents a bit of a problem. I know the norm for this kind of video is just to spew obscenities at the game and like scream or whatever, but that style just wouldn't work for me. Nah, that just doesn't fit the channel. So instead I want to get more analytical with my critical thought. Instead of just hurling insults and calling it a day, let's get to the how and why of the situation. How does this game progress, and why do I think it's not successful at that? But without further ado, let's get to the main course. Why Zelda 2 is a bad game that genuinely hurts me to play, and is evil and probably steals candy from babies or something. So in my last video, I mentioned briefly 3 things that usually make me hate NES games. That being that they're usually either super cryptic and lack any explanation for anything, that they're too hard to the point of bordering on unfair, or that they're poorly designed either due to a lack of experience designing games or just bad design. And unfortunately, Zelda 2 manages to be the freaking poster boy for all 3 of these things. So much so that even the things it does well are absolutely marinated by layers of these design problems. If there was ever a game made to encompass the worst aspects of this era, then that game would look a whole lot like Zelda 2. Before we dig too deep into any of that though, let's briefly cover the story of this game. I promise it won't take that long. So after Ganon was defeated in the last game, somehow a sleeping spell was cast onto Zelda. This will keep her locked perpetually in sleep unless Link can get the 3rd Triforce and use it to break the spell. To do so, Link must travel to 6 different palaces and place a crystal in the statue at the end, which will break the seal holding the 3rd Triforce. However, several people are out to kill Link, I guess, hoping they use his blood to resurrect Ganon, well-known convenience store thief and Dark Lord, who would wreak havoc once again if revived. So it's up to Link to traverse Hyrule, make his way through all the dungeons, get the 3rd Triforce and reawaken Zelda, all without allowing Ganon to be revived. Again, it's a simple plot, but I don't know, it's at least a cooler one than the last game. It feels like there's higher stakes here, and considering the world's actually populated this time instead of just being a barren wasteland, it actually makes the events feel like they mean more, which is kinda cool. So after exiting a castle where Zelda's just gonna sit there unguarded, I guess, you exit out onto a world map. You see, Zelda 2 is split into 2 halves, this free-roaming adventure map and smaller 2D sections more akin to something like Castlevania. While on the overworld map, you'll find that the amount of control you have is dramatically diminished from the previous game. You can move in 4 directions still, but beyond things like breaking stones with a hammer later on, you have almost no other ways to interact with the environment. Link can't even use his sword in these sections, but that's because the fundamental structure of the game has changed. Running into enemies now shifts you into the previously mentioned 2D platformer mode, where the majority of combat is done. Enemies spawn at random, and while you have some ability to dodge them, oftentimes they spawn so abruptly that it's just like, yeah, you ain't dodging that. Now they've actually made some improvements in the way they've structured the world map this time. The game still has a number of secrets built into the overworld, but this time a good chunk of them are much better integrated. There are oftentimes actual signs that there's something special about a particular block, whether it be one oddball square of forest out of nowhere, an area being clearly blocked off by a rock or other object, or having somewhere end in a peninsula, which all would lead the player to assuming that there's probably something of note there. Going to these areas often rewards the player with something, whether it be a bag of experience points or a heart or magic upgrade. This is a much better way of handling things in the first game, as secrets are actually telegraphed in some way, rewarding the player for keen observation and exploration instead of rewarding them for burning every bush in Hyrule. Now trust me, it still has its moments of hiding things in areas with no discernible hints at all, but at bare minimum, improvements have been made, and I feel like that should be acknowledged. The sad part is, they had a good thing going. I mean, they removed one of the most cryptic elements of the first game, but then they decided to double down on the crypticness in a completely different area instead, and one that affects the core of the game much more deeply than anything in Zelda 1. So before going to the first dungeon, you'll likely encounter a town, which is one of the things that Zelda 2 definitely has over its predecessor. Hyrule in Zelda 1 felt oddly empty. There weren't really any towns or any NPCs to interact with, despite being clear signs that there should be life around, so this made the few NPCs that the game did have feel really surreal and kinda strange. It was just an odd world, and so I appreciate Zelda 2's attempts to broaden the world. Sure, the dialogue certainly isn't the most in-depth in the world, but regardless, adding towns and civilization to the world make it feel bigger. It makes the world feel more lived in, and this gives a little bit more weight to the game's story. And continuing on the positives, these towns have places to both refill your magic and health, which is oddly forgiving compared to the rest of the game. Also, okay, so like everyone makes the same joke whenever they talk about this lady, like, haha, what are they doing in there? Firstly, I've heard this joke like 5 million times, I'm kinda tired of it, but they also always fail to mention that the old lady does the same thing for your magic. Wow, why don't people ever mention that? Anyways, while these towns certainly are great in theory, it's what they do to the game's structure that pretty much ruins them. In every town, you have to visit this old wizard dude to get a new magic spell, which is usually required to get to the next dungeon or area. Besides the first one, however, each one will require you to complete some random task to get access to this area. Sometimes it's go talk to an NPC, sometimes it's go find some random kid lost in a cave for some reason. All different tasks, but all of them essentially boil down to roaming the world until you figure out exactly where the items are. The characters give practically no hint as to where you're supposed to go, which would already be annoying enough, but to make matters even worse, these things are usually hidden in the most obscure cryptic areas in the game for some reason. For example, at some point you're told you need to visit a person named Bagu to get access to an area. And it just so happens that Bagu's cabin is hidden in a singular patch of forest that looks absolutely identical to the patches of forest around it. Hooray! There's not even any implication you're supposed to go looking in this specific area, much less this specific tile. You're just expected to roam around until you somehow come across it, I guess. Riveting. Now, not all of them are this bad, but regardless, none of them feel very well explained. It feels like you need a guide to even find these things, which is bad game design. If it's so unclear where to go that you basically either need to roam around aimlessly or go out of your way to use a guide, that means that the game hasn't done a good job of guiding the player, and that's bad. And since you literally need these to progress through the story, it means the player basically has no choice but to just suck it up and deal with it. But what makes it even worse is that they already did this correctly with the secrets. Why are the optional secrets better let into than the things that are actually required for story progression? All they need to do is just give a little more explanation of where these can be found generally, and a little more clear indication on the world map that, hey, this tile in specific might have something special, and suddenly this wouldn't be a problem. But no, gotta arbitrarily extend the game length. We don't want people beating our 5-hour game in 5 hours, so let's just make it like 20 instead. Point is, the game's structure is super cryptic and really annoying. It also doesn't help that this makes the game super linear. Now, I'm not against linear game design, far from it. Some of my favorite games are super linear. The problem is that Zelda 2 is linear while still requiring really obscure stuff of the player, meaning that you never really feel like you're going anywhere if you're not following the game's incredibly specific set of events to the T. In Zelda 1, if you got stuck, you could always just leave a dungeon and go try to make progress some other way. But in Zelda 2, if you get stuck, well, good luck without a guide, I guess. Or, I guess you could have called up the Nintendo Power Hotline when the game was out. I just cannot fathom the idea of actually paying real money to call some guy on the phone to help with a video game. But that begs the question, what if this game was made to get more people to call the hotline? It's the perfect plan. Except it's not, because that's really dumb. You know, it's kind of funny I've went this long without mentioning the signature thing this game is known for, because in the end, most of these things I've discussed so far wouldn't be that huge of a problem in the end if it wasn't for one major issue that corrupts the entire game. So, upon entering the first dungeon, you'll find out a couple things really quickly. 1. All of the enemies are way beyond what would be expected out of the beginning of a game, and 2. You're basically defenseless. The enemies in Zelda II are absolutely merciless in the beginning. They feature attack patterns that in some cases border on ridiculous, and in other cases basically require you to cheese the AI if you want to get anywhere. Now Link certainly controls well in this game, that's not really the issue. He moves at a good speed, his jumping feels pretty alright, and his sword attack, while definitely a little shorter in range than I'd prefer, feels like it comes out without the same momentum problem Zelda 1 suffered from at least. The issue is that while they scaled up Link's mobility overall a little bit, the amount they scaled up the enemies feels like it dramatically exceeds Link's growth. Seriously, if you don't learn how to cheese the AI, then good luck getting anywhere in this game. The normal way they want you to fight the enemies is just ridiculous, slow, and not really fun. In addition, Link's beam attack is made almost entirely useless in this game, only working against the weakest of enemies, meaning that it provides pretty much no use at all in most fights. Enemies also react to Link's attacks at a speed which borders on kind of ridiculous, and the enemies all deal quite a bit of damage, especially considering how little resources Link starts off with. Link starts out with basically no health, no magic, and basically nothing in regards to helpful spells. Furthermore, enemies no longer drop health pickups, which is a luxury even the original provided, meaning that early in the game, there's basically no way to refill your health. And even later on, when you get the healing spell, it heals you so little and costs so much magic that it takes until the last couple dungeons for it to even be a viable option. So now, any single hit is essentially a death sentence, especially early on, where 3 good hits and that's a game over. And boy, you don't want to get a game over, because not only does it send you back to the starting area with Zelda, but also you lose all your EXP as well. Great. Now, all of this is done to prioritize one system, that being the level up system that Zelda II features. Much like an RPG, most enemies you kill give you EXP. Get enough of it and Link levels up, allowing you to boost your magic, health, and even the amount of damage you do. Now, in theory, I actually don't hate this idea. It gives the enemies you fight actual value, and encourages you to actually explore every area, as a lot of the time you'll find these P-bags that'll give you a solid amount of EXP. But I only like this in theory, because in execution, it's something that is not balanced at all. Because you're so weak early on, it basically requires you to grind to get anywhere, and grinding isn't something I really want to do in a Zelda game. And if you think you don't need to grind, that you could just get on by sheer determination, then good luck. If there's one area in the game that showcases just how necessary it is to grind, it's the ever so infamous Death Mountain. Death Mountain is an area you have to go through very early in the game, and it's a maze of caves that features some of the most brutal enemies in the game. Straight up, you don't see anything this complex after this until the final dungeon. And boy, not only are they super aggressive, not only do they hit ridiculously hard, not only are they super hard to cheese, there are basically no pickups or ways to heal along the way as well, meaning that you'll die and die and die if you don't grind enough to be even somewhat capable of taking this area on. Also, might I add that this area is a freaking maze, so now you have to deal with these things on top of trying to figure out where you're even supposed to go. It's just fun. A difficulty spike like this is ridiculously poor design, but it's something that's going to need to be overcome if you want to see anything past the first dungeon. And so, you have to grind. Hooray! Video games are fun! No, but seriously, this isn't fun. It also doesn't really help that the difficulty isn't really all that well balanced. The first chunk of the game is so bloated by difficulty, and yet after Death Mountain, it's just so much easier that it's almost like the developers realized, hey, maybe this is a bit too ridiculous? I mean, sure, some of it comes from getting better at the game, but come on, the enemies it throws at you early on are way harder than anything you have to fight later. I mean, here you basically have to run through this ridiculous, frustrating area with no ways to heal and brutal enemies around every corner, and then suddenly it's like, hey, there are tons of towns to heal up at, so you never really need to go too long without some actual health. And hey, they're offering magic refills in dungeons, meaning that there's actual ways to heal. And hey, those stupid enemies, don't worry, now they're at least a little bit more manageable. Like seriously, what exactly happened here? And you know, when the game isn't slamming you upside the head with difficulty, you can actually notice some of the positives. Like the dungeons, at least structurally, are pretty solid. They feel like these large labyrinths with all these paths to take. Your goal is to unravel it piece by piece, getting keys and opening up new areas and rooms. The structure feels grand, but they never really get too confusing either. The dungeons are perfectly manageable. It's just about uncovering its secrets and slowly finding your way to both the dungeon item and the boss. And exploring these feels even more rewarding than Zelda 1. In Zelda 2, the dungeons feature all these optional paths you can go down, but instead of just being worthless dead ends, these places always reward you with something like EXP, meaning that there's an actual reason to explore. And heck, there are even moments where the dungeons can have some really neat puzzles. One dungeon, for example, features all these little pits that, when fallen into, take the player to a completely different part of the dungeon, meaning the player needs to unravel how exactly each path interlocks and how each of them is important. In another case, I got to use the fairy spell several times for navigation, with one case in specific making some really cool use of the spell in a way I didn't even know was possible. The dungeons are easily my favorite part of the game, which is sad because even they struggle to be nearly as fun as they could be, especially in the later dungeons. No matter how good the dungeon's layout is conceptually, this still doesn't change the fact that most of the time you're still just stuck dealing with the game's ridiculous difficulty. And these dungeons are hurt even further by another issue as well. So out of these 3 sections, this is probably the least applicable to Zelda 2. I mean, compared to some of the literal garbage games that came out of the NES library, Zelda 2 is at least mechanically a functional game. However, the game ain't flawless in this regard. As we've discussed pretty extensively so far, the general structure of the game, the cheap difficulty, the massive difficulty spikes, and the poorly handled leveling system are all pretty poor and could easily be classified under this section. But since repeating that information again would be kinda worthless, I'd like to briefly discuss a couple things that irked me in regards to poor design. So while most things only deal a bit of damage to Link, if Link falls in a water or lava pit, that's an immediate death. Now thankfully early on the game only uses them occasionally, so it's not a massive problem, but that all changes with the last couple of dungeons. They just go hog wild with all these lava pits, and to make matters even worse, they start tossing really infuriating enemy combinations in these same rooms. Combine that with Link's pretty bad knockback, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Things like this just feel like a lazy way of upping the difficulty without having to really do anything, and it kinda sucks. Also, yeah, knockback is really stupid, just saying. Hit detection also is a little inconsistent. It's not like a constant problem, but sometimes I felt like I took damage without the enemy actually touching me, or failed to hit an enemy that looked like I really should have hit them. And speaking of enemies, boy, this game certainly has them, and several of them are really not too fun to deal with. Pretty much every enemy on screen felt a little annoying or poorly designed, with special emphasis going to these Medusa head lookalikes. Screw them. And on one final note for poor design, the pacing is just all over the place. Why is it that sometimes there's like an hour-long stretch between dungeons, and then other cases there's just like 2 minutes in the overworld? Seriously, the stretch between Dungeon 1 and 2 is especially ridiculous, taking me upwards of an hour to get through it. It's just not fun. I feel like the last 2 sections left this one with nothing but scraps, but what are you gonna do? Regardless, as I've explained pretty well by this point, the game is pretty poorly designed at times. It's certainly not the worst in the NES library, not by any stretch, but it's still poorly designed. And you know, since I have a moment, I want to briefly mention the visuals. So I said in the last video that I felt like the visuals in Zelda 1 were a little too simplistic, and that it really didn't impress visually. I can say, however, that Zelda 2 is an improvement at the very least. Enemy sprites look pretty detailed for the hardware, areas now have more intricate designs and backgrounds, but most importantly, Link doesn't look like a munchkin anymore. Sure, his walk cycle looks a little jank, but otherwise, yes, this is what Link looks like, not this. And, you know, I feel like this is going to be a bit of a divisive opinion, but the soundtrack of Zelda 2 is leagues ahead of Zelda 1. The overworld track is catchy, the battle music is super cool sounding, and the dungeon theme is an absolute banger. You know, it probably helps that the game has more than like 3 tracks though. Also, the final dungeon theme in Zelda 1 is this slow, droning theme. It's boring. Zelda 2's though, nah, it's great. And speaking of the final dungeon, well, it's still not really that fun, but by this point I didn't really care. I just wanted to finish the game. So I trekked on through, beat this weird eagle guy, and was put on a one-on-one confrontation with Link's shadow. This is it, a duel for the ages, and it'll take every ounce of strength if I want to... oh, never mind, you just crouch in the corner and cheese it. And so you get the final Triforce and manage to awaken Zelda, who rewards Link with a kiss, I assume. Like, you don't know, they're behind the curtain, they could be doing anything. And that ends Zelda 2. Great, I never want to play that again. You know, there were several instances throughout this video where I was praising the game for some of its better elements. Now sure, the majority of the video was spent complaining, of course, but how can I say I hated the game if I have so many positive things to say about it? Well, what it boils down to is that no matter how many elements I like, no matter how many things were good in theory, and no matter how many things Zelda 2 may have done right, there was one big problem that overshadowed all of that. No matter what I was doing, the game was never fun. And so, even though I had positives to say, I could never really enjoy those things if the game just wasn't fun to play. And you know, I'm still unsure of whether starting this on the first 2 Zelda games was really the best idea. Now sure, it's neat that I got to see where the franchise started, and now I can at least say I beat them, but these games are just so counter to what I like about Zelda. I love the world, I love the characters, I love the stories, I love the distinct dungeons and locales, and I love that I can actually play them without having to constantly look at a guide. In this sense, Zelda 1 and 2 feel hollow to me. Like they're just a proof of concept for something I'd eventually like, but not something I like in their current form. Zelda 1 still had its moments at least. I could see myself revisiting it down the road, even if I likely won't like anything past Dungeon 5. Zelda 2 though, nah, I'll pass. I beat it once and that's as far as I'm going.